He still heals people's bodies and their members. But the most amazing healings that Messiah can perform is Messiah can genuinely take people who have sociopathic tendencies and make them care about their neighbor and cause them to gush with love. God is able to do this. So kind of a bird's eye view. Right now what I want us to see is we've got these three elements. The clothing or covering that makes you allowed to take a step. The equipping to take a step. Okay, the clothing that equips you to take a step. The covering that equips you to take a step. The leader or the meeting leader and the food. Another way to say this is reality is a meal. Reality is a meal between you and God. A feast is a better word than meal. Reality is a party. Because party in English doesn't require food. In ancient times, if you said, I'm throwing a party, and you don't have lavish food set out, it's kind of like, this is a shitty party. Now, in modern times, we're like, hey, there's not good hors d'oeuvres or something like this, but we don't have as much of a structured idea. When they throw a party, their idea, they have like a blend. Their idea of order will accentuate it. Everyone will sit, there'll be places of honor, we'll be seated, this kind of thing, whatever. But there will be freedom of exchange and largesse and lavish, okay? So, reality, God is desirous to meet with you and sit with you and recline with you and eat with you. So focused on this is he that he doesn't want you to worry about the drinks being poured. And he doesn't want to worry about the drinks being poured. He's going to have a leader or a master of the ceremony to take care of it for you. Okay? And your job is to enjoy each other and recline with each other. Now, how does that work itself out in this week's Torah reading? Just as an example to show you how these elements work. In terms of importance, the step is the most important. The clothing is the most important and the most hierarchical. The step is the most holy. That's the second most holy, second most high, like in terms of hierarchy. And that's the least important. But in terms of order, in terms of importance of action, the food comes first. Because God's making much of you. Okay, the food is the most important. The second is in importance is the guy who's serving and doing. The third is the one who's kind of initiated that higher step or getting up to that higher step. Okay, another way to say that is when Moses tells you what to build, he starts in this order and goes down, typically, other than the altar of incense, and there's a reason for its weirdness, I think. It's because of what it does on the Day of Atonement. It moves positions, I think. But basically Moses tells you, hey, when it's time to build a space according to the pattern, he starts here and goes down. But when it's time to set up the space, he starts here and works his way up. Okay? So in the tabernacle, we have the bronze altar, which is the table. Okay? It's the table by which we meet, right? Right there. The food. The priest is the leader, the master of ceremonies. He's the servant who's conducting that meal between you and God if you're an Israelite, because that's your level of access. Okay? And then the covering or step that helps you ascend is the laver, the bronze laver, the basin that you step into and you wash your hands and your feet. So then you're covered in water so you can so you can ascend and go higher. Okay? In the inside the heart or the tent, well, guess what? So now the priests have to conduct with the priest. No, the menorah. The menorah becomes the conductor. It's the meal conductor. So if you do it again with your hand, now the thumb is no longer the priest with the shining oil and the shining clothes. It's the menorah.
What's the menorah?
Your thumb, the leader. It's the conductor. The one the meal conductor. The lamp, the lamp. Thank you. The table of bread, which the priests get to eat. Right? They're fed. Okay? And then we have another step up to cover. It's the incense. The altar of incense produces incense. And what's the point of incense? Part of it is a sweet smell, but it has a dual function. It atones and creates a sweet smell, and it covers. But I'm repeating myself because that's all atonement is, covering. Let's go back for 1 second to that thing about the ark being a metaphor for reality. Go and try to find an English translation that uniformly translates the atonement cover. This word, the atonement cover, is so confusing for them to translate. It's because they don't want to admit that the root kafar, which is atone, literally just means to cover over. It's a fucking lid. The word means lid. Okay? So it's not a special term. They've made it into a special term because it has a correlate. Now, to be fair, there's a bit of a teachability going on where they're like, okay, I do want to teach the play in words, so I can call it atonement cover type of deal. But that's redundant. It's just a lid. It covers over. That's all atonement does. The water covers over you so you can step in. The incense covers over you so you can ascend. Okay? Now,
The blood?
Now, this is what, and the blood is the same. The blood will do the same thing. It will cover over you. But we're actually talking about vessels right now. We're not going to talk about medium. Blood is going to be a special category. Blood's a special category because it'll unite these spaces. But for now, in the next space, which is the Holy of Holies, okay, you have this ark, okay, which is in the space, and it has those same three elements. Except now the meal conductor, okay, is the Torah. By the way, that's all the three of them were. Do you notice that the Torah shines. What is the Torah compared to? What is the Torah itself compared to within the Tanakh, the Old Testament? The Torah is compared to the sun. Go read Psalm 19. The Torah is the sun, the bridegroom in the sky that runs. The Torah illumines and enlightens and it's bright and it's shining. Well, how's that the priest? Because they know the Torah and they direct your movements as well, and they have oil that makes them shine and clothing that shines. Okay, the menorah is literally a light. Okay, that's all it is. And it mirrors the sun because it's the greater light and 6 lesser lights. All right, and then when you're in the ark, the Torah, this deposit, it's the light. It's the one that conducts the meal. Okay, and then you have. And by the way, I just received from the Lord like that. It's a never-ending meal, which is why you would need light in ancient times. A meal that doesn't end. Right? They don't have light switches. So in the ark we have. There's the Torah. This food is the jar of manna, which, by the way, is the food of angels, the food of gods. Now that they've eaten, they're like one of us. Who's the us? Okay? And then the step, ironically, is the staff, because it's not just a staff. The staff is literally now a tree with plumage that covers you. But let's go further. What kind of plumage? Almonds. Why almonds? In Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 11, Yahweh says to Jeremiah, "What do you see?" And Jeremiah says, "An almond branch." Okay? Right here. God, this is the root for almond branch. Okay? He says, "You have seen rightly, for I am guarding my word." This is the word. Shakad is the same word for guard. Okay? What does it mean? It means to be sleepless, to be alert and to be sleepless. To be alert and to be sleepless. In Psalm 127, the guard who guards the city stays up late, goes sleepless in vain, because a guard doesn't sleep. The priests are guardians, right? What's funny about, why is the root for almond the same root for sleepless or early? The almond is the earliest to flower or blossom or mature in their context. It's this really early blossoming plant. What does it become better for? Maturity. The priests are supposed to work themselves out of a job. They're just God's early maturers. There's one way to say it. Okay? Which means we have a mediator who matures ahead of us. Does that sound familiar with the gospel? We have a mediator who is this priest, who is this staff that blooms, that covers us and hides us, who matures ahead of us. What does he cover? Our nakedness. The same way that Adam hid himself behind a tree, right? To hide his nakedness, he'd sewed fig leaves, plumage, right? So we have these elements, right? And what I want you to imagine is, you can imagine the feast. You can imagine the feast that Yeshua talks about, and how you have the appropriate garments or clothing to cover you. Cover your nakedness so that you can go in. You'll have food that's present. You have someone who conducts the meal, right, and guides it and makes sure there's light. Right? This is a picture for how God thinks of reality. This is so far from post-enlightenment, like the world is a machine that has gears and it's like that's not how the Torah talks about the world. Right? Or like the Greeks, the world is. The material thing is a kind of nasty accident. We really need to go on to this celestial, spiritual thing where we escape this weird material world in a Platonic way. That's not how it's spoken of either. But that's very Catholic, and it ends up being very Protestant down the road. This idea that God's fixing of the world is abandoning it and burning it to the ground and you going somewhere else. So a lot of different components. I think the last thing I'll share is God, heart to heart happens in the tent. Mind to mind is like Holy of Holies. And then here's the really cool part. It's like fullness, mano y mano, man on man happens in the conscience. Which is like, sounds very similar to 1 Corinthians 13, right? Where Paul says, I put childish ways behind me, and like a man to man, I behold face to face, no longer like staring dimly into a mirror or just a reflection. Okay? And the last thing I'll leave you with is, well, I won't leave you with that, that'll cause more confusion. So that's it. All right, are there, now I'm leaving you space for questions. Are there any questions? That's not bad. Okay.
Could we put 2 Peter 2:12 at Gentiles, which is like unthinking animals that go about doing things?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that Genesis 2:12 would be associated with Gentiles already for a Jewish reader is the Nachash, the serpent. He represents a shining one. So the word Nachash means a Elohim, a shining one, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't just mean a spiritual being. It also points to the nations who do Nachash, which is divination. Mm-hmm. And so you end up again with this twofold pattern that happens all the time in the Torah. For human forces that are against Yahweh in allegiance with higher order Elohim that are also against Yahweh. All right? And the Nachash, the serpent, represents empire. It represents Egypt, which is why, I mean, that is literally Egypt's, that's his symbol. Mm-hmm. Okay? The word is it's a ur, it starts with an A, a hor, a urus, but it's a cobra. Okay? Mm-hmm. The Nachash represents the Gentiles insofar as they have allied themselves with these Elohim and they are trying to usurp authority. Yeah? And the Torah will say to you, basically God's letting you choose. You don't want to bear my image? You're a fucking animal then. Because the only, if you reject me, right? If you reject me in your presence, you will not be able to have access to me to mirror me, and you will try to rule over things that are lesser than you, and all you'll end up doing is mirroring them. You'll be beasts. Right? So yes.
2 Peter 2:12 is where we got that from. So you could say Gentiles equals unthinking animals.
No, I would say that Gentiles I would say fallen Gentiles, post-Babel, post-flood. You
could put unthinking animals at the step between stuff and people. You do
have that there. Because God does have a plan. One of the problems you'd have with that, Joe, is, maybe at some stage or in some way, but God, in the Torah already, there is an early promise right after the last big exile that says God wants to bless all the nations, all the Goyim, all the Gentiles.
Yeah. Like Romans 2, the Gentiles, even though they don't have a law or a law in themselves, could be the step between people and members. Right? It could be the Korah between people and members could be Gentiles who do become a law unto themselves.
Yeah, and that's actually, that would be a good place to place that. This is part of what Paul means when Paul says, this is how I interpret Paul now in Romans 1, where he says, the invisible qualities of God are made visible through creation. There is this idea that it's this pattern on repeat. It's this pattern on repeat. Yes, it's true that if I could see all of creation, all of it, every part of it, ultimately would assemble to show me that thing. I don't think that's how Paul's intending. I think Paul, the way he's saying it, is more like Wisdom of Solomon, which is, around every corner, everywhere I go, there's the image of God again, there's the pattern again. It shows up in all places.
I feel like it's, this is a little bit more modern scientific language, but I feel like what he's saying there with especially the glory, the majesty is made evident.
Yeah.
That you could say, no part of creation becomes more and more dull. Yeah. Any part of creation that you investigate further into only shows more majesty, not less.
Yeah. Absolutely, because another way to say that is God's intention is for all of it to just keep ascending. Mm-hmm. There's so many things that are really right for this, but I'm excited that for people, if Raven can track with me on the hand, Okay? And so she can identify these three elements. Which, by the way, where else are these three elements named in the Torah? I'll be specific, in Genesis.
In Genesis,
that God
leader,
would say in one encounter, let me be
the
specific.
leader, the food, and the step up. I feel like the story of Joseph has this.
Okay. Watch. So we have clothing, because it's covering, food, okay, and the leader. It's Jacob. It's a vow. It's the story of Bethel. All in one place, we have this. We have in the natural a man who is the image of God resting or Shabbating, laying his head on a stone. Right? So when he lays his head on the stone, he becomes a physical version of the glory of God resting on the temple. And what happens? It's a reversal of what the serpent did to man. The serpent blinded men. So God says, close your eyes and I'll let you really see. In a dream. And in a dream and in visions, he sees the temple. And he sees Yahweh there in person. And what's his response when he wakes up? He anoints the stone and then he says this. He sets up this scenario. Israel sets up the scenario and says, all right, look, if you'll give me food on my journey. He's on a journey. It's a journey where at the end of the journey he's supposed to get back to God, to the temple. He says, on this journey, if you return me to my father's house with food, with clothing, right? Then I'll establish a priesthood. I'll give a tenth of everything I own. And on this rock, I'll build a house. Okay? You have all the components in Genesis 28. And one reason it's important to camp out there is this was important enough for the Apostle John to start his story. When he started, after John starts giving the first temple claim John makes about Yeshua, after Yeshua is brought into the narrative itself and is speaking and is out of the Messiah's own mouth, is Genesis 28. That's important. So John's telling us the story of Jesus. Take note, it takes John quite a while to actually get to Yeshua of Nazareth himself in the story. Right? And the first time we have Yeshua himself giving a claim regarding his identity, he says, oh, you believe because you say I saw you sitting under the fig tree? Right? Or because you were hiding among the tree, maybe? One way to read that is possible. Okay? I tell you the truth, you'll see greater things than these. You'll see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Alright? So he is partly telling you, he is saying his identity. For John, he is saying, this is the way I want you to first hear Jesus talk about Jesus. The first time John has Jesus talk about Jesus, that's what he says.
Genesis 18. Abraham, when he entertains the three men.
That's a great place, dude. That's a great place. I love that place now.
There too you have the meeting place. You have Abraham provides the food.
Yes.
And the angels are the leaders.
Yeah.
And they give him the step up. And they're like, oh, I'll come back next year, you'll have a child.
Yeah.
This is a covenant with you. And then it's interesting too because there's almost like a second step up that happens with Abraham when he starts arguing with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he's like, should we unveil our plans? Should we tell him what we mean to do?
Yeah.
And then he enters into there is this step that happens there too.
Yeah.
Because of the way that I honestly you could probably say that is another whole step in the end of that chapter because it's a meeting place.
Yeah.
There's something given.
Yes.
There is leadership and there's Abraham ascends.
Yes.
In that sense too.
Yeah.
Because he's like, forgive me for doing it. But can I speak? Can your servant speak another word to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That exchange in 18. This is helpful because by pointing out Abraham in 18. I had this realization the other because I'm trying to look through the Torah with a foundational lens, and recovering things. You have even the story of God's intentions. It speaks to. Let me turn this on. Let's see here. It speaks to the gut or the courtyard or God's plan for the story of a child and what it's supposed to be like, what the stages, how the stages are supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And what's cool is you have the old man Abraham, this mature old man, okay, and it's like God's like, I'm going to start building with you. And he starts from that early time, and it's a miracle. It's out of Tohu Vavohu,
Mm-hmm.
this dead woman's barren womb.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I'm going to create life in it. And when that life comes, God's not embarrassed of pleasure. I have realized that I am impoverished in this area, and I put that impoverishment on people that I've discipled for years. I'm trying to repair that and repent. God's not embarrassed of pleasure. Pleasure. His name for Isaac is Yitzchak. It means he laughs or laughter. Another way to take Yitzchak is there's a related shorish that means to make sport or to play, right? And it's one of the
Fun.
yeah, but it means like dance and be ridiculous and raucous and make play. That's the verb that's used when Michal looks at David. That motherfucker. David is in his linen garment and he's playing, he's dancing, and he's laughing. He's literally the translation of what he does. If you read that story in Chronicles and in Samuel, all those words are used of him. He laughs, he plays, he dances, he does all this stuff, and Michal looks at him and despises him while he brings that ark back. But that's God's plan for a new people, an early people. That's what he wanted to do with Adam and Eve, is this idea of laughter and blessing, and he intends to give that. Yeah. And separately in 18, one of the things that's cool is God's invited you to, by existing, God's invited you to a meal. So it makes, based on this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's a good there's so many ways to say this, but for one narrow way to see this is because God's invited you to a meal, just by merit of making you exist, it is fair for him to decide if you really are worthy to take part in the meal by coming to you and see if you'll invite him to a meal. If he comes as his image.
Well, yeah, just thinking about that too, is like the parallel is what Abraham attempts to do is be the leader, provide the food, and invite them in to like share space with him.
Yeah.
And then what ends up happening is Yahweh's like, oh, I have something for you, and I'll lead you, and I'll help you step up.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's weirdly like it's not reciprocity. It's grace. Yeah.
It's back and forth outdoing one. It's outbowing.
Yeah.
It's the idea of giving people crowns, and what do you do with a crown? Well, I guess you take it off and you put it back at the feet of the one who gave it to you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to turn this off, and let's see how this works. Never done that before.